I'm Heather, and this is the Living with Addiction podcast, where I show you how you have more power than you realize when it comes to helping yourself and your child that's struggling with addiction. Hey, there's a new day for the podcast. Thursday just doesn't work with my schedule anymore, so Friday's the new day. Make sure that you subscribe so you always get notification that there's new episodes automatically each week. And also, if you haven't done it yet, please leave a review on iTunes. Reviews help other parents that really need it find this podcast. And you know how bad you needed this podcast when you found it. And you can help somebody else who really needs help with their child's addiction just by leaving a review. That will help get it in front of more parents. Okay, so on with today's episode. I want to talk about the rejection wound today because focusing on healing your own emotional wounds is where the magic is when it comes to your child's addiction. That's where the situation really starts to change for the better. We're all responsible for our own healing, just like we want our kids to be. Even if you get hit by a bus crossing the road, you have to be the one to heal your wounds and go to physical therapy if you need it. The bus driver is not responsible for healing you or making you feel better. We're responsible for healing our emotional wounds in the same way we're responsible for healing our physical wounds. Emotional wounds generally come from childhood experiences, but you didn't have to have a so-called bad childhood to have them. The events of our childhood are processed with a child's brain. So some situations that an adult might process okay and not have any problems with can leave an emotional wound for a child. And our child's addiction is a trigger for all of our emotional wounds. And that can leave us feeling helpless and powerless and overwhelmed and even unsafe. Like just all of the feelings that we feel as parents that just wash over us pretty much the moment we realize how bad our child's addiction is. When we go from thinking, oh, maybe they're just experimenting or blaming it on something else to really realizing what we're dealing with. Their behavior is a giant spotlight on all your pain and vulnerabilities, and that spotlight never goes off when you're dealing with addiction. But we see their behavior as the cause of the problem. But the bad thing about that is it leaves us completely powerless and unable to change unless somebody else changes. And, if changing everybody else was possible, my podcast would be called How to Change Your Child instead of Living with Addiction. I show you how to live with it because you can't change it. Instead of labeling your child's triggering behavior as a problem, try to see it as a healing opportunity. What is your reaction showing you about yourself? You have to bring emotional wounds into your awareness in order to heal them. When you're reactive, no matter how hard you try not to be, then your child is triggering an emotional wound. You always know that. When you can't control your response, you've had an emotional wound triggered. There are emotional wounds other than rejection, but looking at the rejection wound will give you some insight into healing any emotional wounds that you have. And the self coaching model, which I described in episode 16, helped me to see and heal many of my emotional wounds without even really realizing that I had them or what they were. It just made everything very obvious to me. I didn't even understand any of this yet. And I was already healing myself by going through the exercises of doing the models and bringing everything into my awareness. As I wrote the models, I brought all the layers of what was triggering me into my awareness and I questioned them. And that helped me to start to heal them because I could see in a lot of cases where I just didn't believe that. And it wasn't rational, it was just my subconscious autopilot behavior. Emotional wounds and subconscious beliefs, don't have to be they don't have to make sense because we're not intentionally programming them into our subconscious. It just happened unintentionally. That's why they don't always make sense. That's also why awareness and questioning your beliefs and emotional wounds is an important part of the process of reprogramming what you think and believe. The model helps you see when you think someone is rejecting you that you then create rejection for yourself when all you really want is acceptance. It's another example of creating the opposite of what you want. And you just repeat that over and over again if you can't see it. In episode number 2, How to Connect with Your Child That's Struggling with Addiction, I shared some of my before and after examples of interactions with my daughter. They're actual models, but I didn't call them that in that episode because I wasn't ready to introduce the model yet. But as if you've listened to the model episode and then you go back and you listen to episode number 2, you'll recognize that that's how I'm talking. I'm talking in my models. And in my before models, I took everything that she did as personal. All of my interactions with her, I felt like she was constantly rejecting me and like I wasn't a good enough mother. But in my after models, I was able to respond to her with love because I didn't make any of her behaviors about me. And it's funny because one of the examples I used was like, we were just at lunch and she didn't like her lunch. And I would have made that mean that I was a terrible mom and that, I could never make her happy. She wasn't even complaining, but all of these things would have been going on in my mind. And instead, I just, like, shared my lunch with her because that's what first thing that came to my mind when I wasn't taking it personal or making it mean that I wasn't a good mom because she didn't like her lunch. So, that's a really great eye-opening episode to see just how big the before and after difference is when you step outside of those wounds and start coming from a place of love, that authentic place that you want to be able to show up for your child with. And I'm probably going to refer to a few other podcasts I've made in this episode because healing our emotional wounds is really where all of this work comes together. Like I said before, it's where the magic happens. So I'm throwing those episode numbers in so you know which ones to listen to next if you're listening for the first time, or if you listen all the time, you can go back and refresh your memory with those if you don't remember them. So back to my before and after models from episode 2. I was really sensitive to rejection, as that story was a great example of. Like I saw it whether it was there or not. And that's what happens when we make other people's behavior about us instead of about them. So even if your child is acting out towards you, it comes from who they are and what they believe about themselves. When you're confused by somebody's reaction to a situation, it's often because they're responding from an emotional wound rather than emotional adulthood where they're fully responsible for their own emotions. And so they're not reacting to the current situation, they're reacting from that place where they're wounded. And it's the same reason why no matter how hard you try, you can't change your reaction to your child's addiction. And I know that this is just maddening for some parents. They don't understand why they can't change how they're reacting. They plan ahead, they write out scripts, they practice them, they have the best of intentions, but somehow they always end up engaging in an argument, losing their temper, or crying, and then they're frustrated because they don't like how they showed up yet again. These kinds of wounds I'm talking about, these emotional wounds, is where overreaction like that comes from. And it's why you struggle to change how you respond to your child's addiction instead of reacting to it. It's because you're not reacting to what's actually happening in that moment. You're reacting from this deep, painful wound. And this pairs really well with episode number 24, How to Master Your Response to Your Child's Addiction. I talk all about how to identify how you overreact. And it's really important to be able to see those signals. It talks about what it looks like to act out and lash out towards your child, from one end of, lashing out to the other spectrum of turning it inward and using it against yourself and getting depressed. If everything in your life is going through the perception filter of rejection, then everything that you experience is rejection, and it's about you, and it's painful, even if it's not actually about you. This can be caused by, as I said earlier, your parents. Maybe you felt rejected by them as a child, which isn't about you. It's about them and their inability to show love. But a child can't understand that. So they feel unworthy and rejected. Or maybe it's just something that one of your parents said one day that as a child, your brain just processed it as rejection and it stuck with you. It makes a situation that's slightly painful exponentially more painful because you're attaching all this meaning to it, all these thoughts about it. And a child's addiction is painful enough on its own. And we can give ourselves the gift of just letting it be that. Just experiencing what it is on its own without adding all this additional pain to it. But when it triggers your wounds and you make it about you, then it leads to great suffering. And as I was researching for this episode, I saw that the feeling of rejection is actually processed in your brain similarly to physical pain. So it feels threatening to us. That's why we respond so strongly to it. That's why we have to heal that wound so that we can change how we show up. In order to heal this wound, you have to explore your belief about why you think everything is rejection and where it comes from. Generally, all we want is love and acceptance and connection, but the rejection wound keeps us from getting it. Love, acceptance, connection, it might be there. It might be being offered to you. It might be available to you, but you can't receive it in if you don't feel that you're worthy of it. And the worst part of emotional wounds is we recreate them over and over again with our perception, whether it's happening or not. We just keep living in it. So, in order to stop recreating it, you can take these 3 steps to heal the rejection wound. Number 1 is acknowledge and accept it. Acknowledge and accept it is step number 1. Accept the wound as part of yourself. Embrace it instead of trying to ignore it or reject it or blaming things outside of you for it. You have to embrace the good and the bad, the dark and the light sides of your personality. Otherwise, you're essentially rejecting aspects of who you are. So you're creating more rejection if you're not accepting that as part of yourself. The opposite of rejection is acceptance, and you need to accept yourself before you will be able to feel it from anybody else. Step number 2, forgive the person or situation where the wound happened, if you can identify it. For me, I couldn't ever identify exactly where it came from. I just knew that it was happening, and I was still able to heal that situation in my life. So if you don't have an exact situation that needs forgiveness or healing, then that's okay. You can still work through this process. But if there are situations that you remembered, or even maybe you need to forgive yourself for all of the wounds that you have, continued to create in your life by living in this pattern. So step number 2 is forgive the person or situation where the wound happened. And forgiveness doesn't let them off the hook, but it relieves you of the burden of carrying around the anger and constantly rejecting yourself. You can't erase what happened, but you can make peace with it. You can rewrite the story and make sure to give yourself lots of grace. Forgive yourself for continuing to participate in recreating the rejection in your life. Treat yourself with that love and attention that you want from others, and then you'll be able to start receiving it in your life. And step number 3 is to track your triggers. When you get triggered, write about it. I highly recommend writing it. Don't just try to think it through. When you write it, you access a different part of your brain and you're able to see things in a different way. There's something about getting it out of your head and onto a piece of paper that helps you really look at it in a totally different way. And if you know how to do models, then do models. Otherwise, fully explore, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? How did it feel in your body? Where was it? And what did you do when you were triggered? This will help you identify signals that it's happening again. So next time, you'll remember this process and you'll catch yourself sooner because you'll see that as a signal that you're triggered and you can excuse yourself or walk away, or maybe even just change how you're responding. But this is why it's so important. You have to be able to see it in order to change it. The other part of that is after you write what happened, write how you want it to happen the next time and practice it until it becomes second nature. That's how you overwrite those old neural pathways and create new ones. So that's it. If you keep taking these steps as often as it takes, then you'll stop seeing everything through the rejection filter and you will get to like how you show up in situations that would have triggered you in the past. It's going to take time and practice. Be patient with yourself, but it works. I've had clients totally stop being triggered in just the first few weeks of working with me. They showed up for calls, they worked on the Peace of Mind program in between, and they had immediate changes in their relationship with their child and others. So if you struggle, you try to do this and you struggle with it and you need help, use the link in the show notes and sign up for a call with me and I'll help you work through it. That's all I have for today. I will be back next week. Remember, on Friday. I'll talk to you then. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about my work, go to heatherrosscoaching.com. If you want to help other parents who are struggling with a child's addiction, you can do it 2 different ways. First, you can share the podcast with them directly, or you can share it on your social media. Second, you can leave a review. Talk to you next week.